What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you everything there is to know about Starfield ahead of its release. Now, as we probably all know, especially if you clicked on this video, Starfield is the upcoming game from Bethesda Game Studios that will be a first/third-person space exploration game. Originally slated to release later this year, actually, in November, it was ultimately delayed until the first half of 2023. We do not have a set release date on that yet. Anywhere between February and June, I think, would be the most likely. I sincerely doubt they would release it in January. But before we start jumping into the nitty-gritty about what this game is and what to expect, I do want to mention that all of this information is stuff I've compiled from various interviews, etc., and I'll try to post links to those down below if you'd like to see them for yourself. And moving forward, as we get closer and closer to the release date, it is very likely that they will release deep dives on these individual features. However, given the recent big gameplay reveal at Summer Game Fest, as well as a lot of other information we were then given in interviews, etc., I would say everything that I'm going to cover in this video is pretty much what you can expect from the game. Though, that said, specific things like numbers and exact iterations of skills, etc., will likely change, at least to some degree, as they work on balance and optimization, etc., bug fixes, all that jazz. But again, moving closer to release, I would expect more deep dives on these systems from Bethesda Game Studios themselves. However, if you are familiar with Bethesda Game Studios and their, of course, previous works like Skyrim, Oblivion, etc., I think you'll be familiar with the broad systems that we're going to go over today, as a lot of what is in this game and what we saw in the reveals, etc., seems to be a combination and iterations of their previous systems. In fact, we even see a potential lead into a banking system that we haven't seen since, I believe it was Daggerfall. But we'll get into that. So, to kick this off, let's talk about the role-playing systems we can expect, starting at the most natural place of character creation. So first up, I think it's worth mentioning that you're likely only going to be able to play as a human. While there are other alien species and animals and things that we'll be encountering, it was mentioned in an interview, however, that we're not sure that there's any other sentient alien life out there. As we see in the gameplay trailers, etc., it's only ever humans on screen, including yourself. And again, from the interviews, it seems to be that at least part of the main story will be exploring whether there is any other sentient life out there in all these stars, etc. But I imagine also that this is something that is being intentionally obfuscated, especially if it's tied to the main story. So something to keep in mind. But character creation looks like it's only going to be available to the human beings. You're going to be able to adjust your appearance in ways you would pretty much expect. It's worth mentioning that on screen, we can see that this is something that can be changed later, our appearance, the specifics of which are up in the air, but we will be able to change this once the game is actually started. And something I like that hasn't been in prior Bethesda Game Studios games, so I'm mentioning it here, is that we'll be able to customize our character's body type as well as even their gait or how they walk, which is interesting. And then we have things like backgrounds. Backgrounds are essentially the starting class in Starfield. Picking a background is going to give you 3 starting skills, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the backgrounds, I think more than anything, are fantastic for role-playing, as there are apparently going to be about 20 of these, but as you can see on the side, there's things like cybernetics expert or chef, and these backgrounds kind of give your character a reason to be good at something right at the start of the game, which again, I think opens up just tons of opportunities for role-playing, and then you can kind of build a story for your character, which is one of many ways that Starfield is kind of leaning more into the role-playing aspect than they have in quite a while, frankly, as a lot of Bethesda Game Studios' more recent titles have been almost more action games than RPG at times, for the more hardcore RPG crowd anyway. But backgrounds, again, essentially like a small class versus starting point. It is not, however, the final place you'll wind up, which is mostly down to the skills, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Additionally, at character creation, you also can pick up to 3 optional traits. Traits are something we've seen in other titles where essentially you pick up a positive effect while trading off a negative thing that you take along with it. So you'll gain a benefit while also taking on a positive. From reading on screen, we can actually look at these traits and see some of what we have in store from other systems. In fact, one of these traits offers up a house, but at the cost of coming with a mortgage, which might sound a little silly, but for people who played Daggerfall, there was a full-on banking system in that game with like interest rates, etc. You could take loans out for ships, all that stuff. And because of that, I'm genuinely curious how in-depth this is going to be, because this is a system that has largely been seen as, kind of annoying. People don't like dealing with mortgages in real life, let alone trying to worry about the interest rate on their house in a video game type thing. So I'm curious just how in-depth that actually goes. But nonetheless, it looks like we're going to see returns of some of those systems if these traits are anything to go by. And again, traits are just a fantastic way to add to the role-playing of a character and make them feel like more of an individual. From there, let's talk about skills. From the recent gameplay reveal, we know that skills are broken down into physical, social, science, combat, and tech. While I'm not going to go over any individual skill, I think those broad categories can give you an idea of what you're working with there. But broadly speaking, there are going to be 4 tiers of each skill, at least in this current iteration, and you will unlock new skills by leveling up. However, you can also rank these skills up as well. This is again a sort of combination and iteration of previous Bethesda Game Studios systems, such as Skyrim's level by doing system, and then Fallout 4's perk system, where you would get a point per level to increase either your base stats or rank up a skill or unlock a new skill. So this kind of combines all of those systems. So you'll unlock them by using skill points as you level up, and then to rank a skill up, you'll actually have to complete various challenges that involve using that skill, which will then make you better at it, hence the rank up. I like that a lot, actually. I think that is a great answer to problems that would arise from both systems, because with Fallout 4, there was just so many perks and stuff available that it can be a little overwhelming trying to plan it all out. And then on the Skyrim approach thing, where it's just level by doing, when you get to the late game, if you haven't leveled up a certain skill and you want to double back to it, you feel like you have to go back and kind of grind it up to get competitive with where you're at in the game now. So I think this is a system that kind of solves both of those issues. And while, of course, we'll have to see how it actually plays out in game, on the face of it, I like this system. Now, let's talk dialogue a little bit. Our character, once you get them all sorted out and everything, they will not have a voice. They will not be voice acted. Personally, huge fan of that. I understand why people like a voice protagonist, but I think the trade-off that you make for the limitations of the voice acting to things like role-playing, etc., are just not worth the trade-off. I would much rather have a non-voiced protagonist. This way the writing can encompass many more responses, etc., because they don't have to be voice acted, which of course costs time and money to do. And frankly, I think a non-voice protagonist just makes the storytelling easier. I think it makes for RPGs that are easier to expand on and let the individual playing the title actually kind of impose what they think it is on that person and not have to worry about things like the tone of somebody's voice when they're voice acting, etc. Personally, again, big fan of there not being a voice protagonist. That said, they are not skimping out on the dialogue. Apparently, they are going to have about 200,000 lines of dialogue from NPCs, of course, which is much more than any of their previous titles, if you want a comparison. And then I want to talk about crafting a tiny bit here. So we see a little bit of crafting in the gameplay trailer. However, what we see on screen is research projects. Now, I'm not sure if these research projects are the crafting or if this is like unlocking new crafting recipes, etc. So I'm not exactly sure how it's going to work, but we know there will be crafting of some sort. And what we do know is that the weapon modding system from Fallout 4 will be making a comeback. And I think that's great. That was actually a great system from Fallout 4, was the ability to customize and change your weapons out. Now, what I did not care for in Fallout 4 was the sort of legendary affix system. If you're unaware, in Fallout 4, it was actually very hard to find genuinely unique weapons because typically unique weapons were actually just weapons with a name and a generic legendary effect that could drop from legendary enemies. So Righteous Authority, for instance, a very common laser weapon that you think is unique when you get it, technically isn't, because you can find legendary weapons with that effect that drop. They just aren't called Righteous Authority, and they look exactly the same model-wise, etc. So I hope they don't keep that part of the system, but the weapon modding system from Fallout 4, which allowed you to really customize and change how weapons worked, was a ton of fun, and I'm glad to see that returning in a game like Starfield. But from here, let's talk about main story a little bit. Now, this is broad strokes. I wouldn't consider any of this spoilers, but you've been warned, I suppose. The game itself takes place in the year 2330. Now, thanks to a bit of a lore reveal we had a while back, we do know a tiny bit more about this, at least in terms of the timeline. About 20 years before the start of Starfield, there was a war between a couple of the factions that has since kind of died down that we know about. So there's been some conflict in the past, something to keep in mind. The year that we're playing in, at least at the start, is 2330. I'm curious how far time will be advancing. One would assume with things like space travel, etc., that time is very likely passing to some degree. But beyond that, the story we've been told is going to be about 30 to 40 hours, the main story that is, so if you're just doing the main story. And to put that in comparison with previous BGS titles, that is a bit longer than their usual 25 to 30 hour mark, give or take. However, if you've ever played a BGS game, I think a lot of people would agree that the main story tends to be the least interesting part. And exploration and running around doing what you want is much more of a thing. That said, for the main story, we will be working with the faction known as Constellation. It seems like everyone joins this faction, and for the main story, we'll be trying to gather up artifacts. These artifacts apparently impart some sort of vision, as we learn about in the story section of the gameplay trailer, and the mystery around these artifacts, what they do, what they're for, where they're from, is up to you to solve. That seems to be like a big focus of the main story, so I'm curious to see where that goes. Pretty interesting. Again, I think it's going to involve, is there some sort of other sentient life form out there, which seems to be what they're hinting at. Now, just to get it out of the way, there are plans for DLC and post-release content, but I would say that's pretty much a given for a game of this scope, but they did mention it in an interview, so I wanted to mention it here. And then Constellation, the faction that we'll be primarily engaging with for the main story, is based out of a city called New Atlantis. New Atlantis is a sort of high-tech human settlement, and it is one of 4 major cities in the game. Now, it can be safely assumed there will be other smaller hubs, etc. around Starfield's 1,000 planets, but we'll get to that. But again, New Atlantis is one of 4 of the major cities. We actually do know a little bit about one more of them, known as Neon. Neon is sort of a pleasure city, if you will. For instance, some of the lore that they've revealed previously has told us that there is a drug that is only legal in Neon that people go there to use, and it's a sort of glitzy, glamorous place that seems to be all about vices, that type of thing. But each of the major cities, it can be safely assumed, is going to offer you the major services. You can buy and upgrade your ships, that type of stuff, buy equipment, basically everything you would expect from a town hub, things like quests. Obviously, the factions will be partaking in some of that, so let's talk about the factions we do know about, of which there are a couple. The United Colonies, the Crimson Fleet, as well as the Freestar Collective. Now, the Crimson Fleet are the pirates. By the way, you are supposed to be able to join these factions. That actually mentions that in the trailer. They're kind of talking to you as if they want you to join their faction, so we know that's going to be a thing, and presumably there's going to be quest lines around that. And the fact that you can join the pirates, known as the Crimson Fleet, would imply that you can be the bad guy right out of the gate, which is a little unusual for BGS. Oftentimes they tend to pigeonhole you into being the savior, which makes me feel like they're at least listening to feedback on opening up their role-playing a little bit. So the Crimson Fleet are the pirates, like I said, and then there's the United Colonies, or the UC, I believe it is. I might be slightly wrong on the name there. It's a little hard to make out in some of their trailers, but it's something like United Colonies, UC something. But they seem to be a more militant organization that is highly kitted up, ready to go, very much so the Force. And then we have the Freestar Collective, which from what we know about them seems to be a more loose organization of people just trying to get by, more or less. This is probably the one we know the least about. And then, of course, there's the Crimson Fleet, space pirates. Naturally, this is your sort of lawless faction that you can join up with, and I imagine they're going to be diametrically opposed to most of the other factions. I assume this is the sort of bad guy route through the game, but I guess we'll see. But when it comes to the factions, before I leave you guys, what we don't know is how tied these guys are to the main story. Like, obviously, they're tied to the places you're going, so you're going to see them around. But typically in BGS games, the factions oftentimes are relegated to side quests, etc. And then we had Fallout 4, where the factions were very much so tied to the main story. So because of that, it's hard to say how much each of these will or won't be tied to the main story. So I guess we'll kind of have to wait and see in that regard. But given that they're so closely knit to the cities in which we see them in, I think it's safe to say they might have something to do with the main story, but admittedly that part's just speculation on my end. Now, beyond those, I imagine we'll likely see minor factions, etc. pop up on the various planets we can explore, but it would appear that these are the major factions that we can expect to be dealing with. Now, from here, let's talk about exploration. So, the beginning of the game apparently starts for most people the same way, so to speak, or at least the introduction to the game. Then you'll eventually get to a point where, like all BGS games, they kind of throw you out into the open world, or in this case, open universe, and they kind of just let you go wherever and do whatever. During an interview, we've learned that the return of the step-out moment, as they like to call it, will be, of course, added to Starfield. I think that was always a given, but due to the nature of going to all these planets, etc., it appears there will be multiple step-out moments. However, there will, of course, be like the handcrafted moments where you kind of really get to see the scope of what you're asked to explore, that type of stuff, which, as you've probably seen online at some point up to this point, includes 1,000 planets. So a few things on this. For starters, according to Todd Howard's recent interview with IGN, the world of Starfield, or the universe of Starfield, will include more handcrafted content than they've ever made before. And that yes, procedural generation is involved in making those 1,000 planets, because obviously it was. However, I do not think the use of procedural generation in and of itself is a bad thing. I just think it leads to the potential for a lot of empty and uninteresting planets. That said, if you're unaware, BGS has used procedural generation for a lot of their games in some capacity. For instance, Skyrim has a lot of procedural generation. It's often how they build their landscapes, and then they kind of go behind it and kind of fix some things here and there and tidy it up, so to speak. But procedural generation is in charge of a lot of what they do, including the Radiant quest that we saw in Skyrim. So while these 1,000 planets definitely use procedural generation, and are fully explorable, by the way, it was also mentioned that they're going to be sort of using almost Daggerfall-esque systems where some content and events and things will spawn on these planets using their procedural generation system. So I think the main thing that has me curious about these 1,000 planets is whether or not how they're procedurally generated turns out to be any good, because this is a system I could see going either way. Either it's really cool and makes for some unique moments, or it's incredibly dull and boring and there's just nothing on most of these planets. Now, in order to get to those planets, you have to, of course, use space travel, which is where things get very fun. Now, before we jump into the space travel portion of this, I did want to mention that being on a planet and being in space are sort of separate. There is a loading screen between these two things. You cannot fly a ship and then fly it directly down onto a planet. You're going to be doing this through loading screens. Now, when it comes to landing on a planet, you can choose to land on specific places, such as going to a city that is on that planet, or you can choose to land anywhere on that planet, which then, of course, brings you to the fully explorable 1,000 planets part of things. And you can do this to build outposts, get resources, etc., which we'll talk about here in a bit. But before we move on a little bit, I want to say that the 1,000 planets and them being in the game and the tools for them being in the game, regardless of how they wind up being and feeling inside the actual title, I think it's important to remember that that is an absolute playground for the modding community, which Bethesda Game Studios has in spades, that is to say, a modding community. Most of BGS's games are ultimately kept alive by the modding scene, and I think this particular approach with all these planets, etc., and the tools to make them are going to give modders a fantastic playground to build some really creative stuff, even if the planets themselves in their vanilla state are boring. So something to keep in mind there. Now, as I mentioned, you could build outposts. Apparently this is probably going to be like settlement building from Fallout 4. However, this primarily seems to be a way to gather resources, etc. But interestingly enough, they mentioned that you could hire people to sort of run these outposts for you. And I'm curious about the depth of a system like that. For instance, are these just random people that you hire to do things, or are these people that you've actually met? Because in the reveal, if you will, it was said that these would be people that you met, that you hire to run these things. So I'm curious, again, about the depth of that system. And while building a base is cool enough, I'm just curious what all these bases are going to be able to do for you, besides provide a safe refuge while you're exploring a certain planet or something. Again, this is just one of those systems where, in and of itself, I think it's pretty benign, but how good it is really depends on its implementation in this particular game, and we'll see where it lands. Now, beyond that, in order to travel planet to planet, we of course need a spaceship. And we will be able to fly that spaceship and engage in combat with it as well. Now, the spaceships, I think, are especially interesting because apparently we're going to be able to build and customize our own spaceship in addition to just acquiring them via stealing them or something. So you can steal spaceships. That's apparently absolutely a thing. And some spaceships can even use crews to actually fly around. So I'm curious how the crew member system is going to work with also stealing spaceships. For instance, if you have a crew, does that then transfer to the new one if you steal it? Might be getting a little ahead of myself there, but they didn't explain some of the interplay there, and hopefully that's something that we'll see more of a deep dive on as we approach release. But apparently you can hire crews for your spaceships, steal them from other people even, and in fact, you can even use your spaceship and others apparently to smuggle things. So smuggling is like a valid way to make money apparently, which again on its face pretty cool but need more details. Then we have the ship combat. So when you're building and customizing your ship, you have to remember what your ship is capable of, because ship combat is a thing, especially when it comes to space pirates. As most of the combat footage we see them fighting the Crimson Fleet, so it's safe to assume space pirates will be trying to steal your ship or whatever else. Now apparently it's possible to, in addition to firing on other ships, etc., it's possible to actually board their ship during space combat, which would then lead to stealing the other ship, etc. So curious to see how some of that plays out. But there's room there for intricate systems that I think could lead to a lot of fun gameplay. And before we leave off on that subject, when it comes to ship combat, according to Todd Howard, a lot of it was inspired by Faster Than Light, which is a sort of spaceship combat thing, as well as Mecha Warrior. So interesting throwbacks, and I'm curious to see how it actually pans out. It's not like super fast paced or anything, but pretty cool to see. And then last but not least, let's talk about actual combat. So given that this is an RPG, I don't think the combat's going to be amazing or anything, that is to say the running and gunning. However, I do think it has more interesting prospects than people would initially think just watching the trailer. So for starters, we've only seen a couple of weapons in game. It's safe to assume there's going to be a lot of others. We see a portion where they're using a mining drill as a weapon that we also see them using to gather resources earlier, so apparently that's usable as a weapon as well. We see them use an automatic weapon, and there's a semi-automatic pistol we see them use. So there's some weapon variety here. We can see on screen that there's a grenade option as well. In the combat portion of the gameplay, we also see them shoot at an enemy's jetpack, which then blows up and sends them flying. We also see them use their own jetpack to fly around and use that to shoot, so there's going to be a jetpack involved. There's a portion of the trailer where we see them fighting in zero gravity, so zero gravity fights are apparently going to be a thing. So while I admit what they showed off in their gameplay trailer on the combat front was a little overall, I think there's potential here for something really cool, and I wouldn't write it off just yet until we have more information. But there you go, guys. That is basically everything there is to know about the upcoming release of Starfield, at least currently. Overall, just to give a conclusion and some personal opinions here, I think Starfield is aiming to be a gigantically ambitious game. On one hand, I think you can expect a sort of classic BGS experience in, how their games play. I think Todd described it as Skyrim in space in terms of gameplay at one point, but I think just from watching the recent reveals, etc., and the iterations on the systems, I think they've very clearly listened to feedback, at least from what they've showed, and that part has me excited. So while there are parts of this that I think can be up in the air, for instance, the 1,000 Planets thing, I think that has a lot of potential to just be super boring. And then on the other hand, I think with what modders are capable of doing with it, which is classic Bethesda game studio games really, it could also be amazing, especially with mods. And then even with the combat, which also looks okay for the most part, also has really interesting portions to it that I think could be really cool, like the zero gravity stuff or the space combat. But overall, broad strokes, Starfield is aiming to be a wildly ambitious game that really seems to be open to letting you roleplay the character that you want to play. And while obviously I'll review it when it actually launches so we can take a more deep dive into what we actually get, I think it's a safe bet that regardless, Starfield is going to be a gigantic game that carries forward and iterates on a lot of role-playing systems that we will very likely see in the Elder Scrolls 6 in some capacity. So there you guys go, everything we know about Starfield. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, just thank you so much for watching, truly, especially if you watched all the way to the end. This was a bit of a long one. So thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.